Hello everyone and welcome to the Prado Museum in Madrid, Spain. We're continuing our Wednesday morning series of short conversations in English, thanks to the help of the American Friends of the Prado Museum. We are a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting the museum and helping share this collection in as many ways as we can, including these conversations in English. And today we are in one of the rooms with the collection of sculpture. And we'll be looking at just one of these pieces, this sculpture, this Roman sculpture in marble of Hypnos, that is a replica of a Greek bronze. And the replica was made between the years probably about 120 to 130. Now Hypnos was the god of sleep. Hypnos, his name, gives us the origin of the word hypnosis. And Hypnos lived with his brother. His brother was Thanatos, the god of death, in the underworld. His mother was Nyx, the Greek goddess of the night. And according to mythology, Hypnos had 1,000 children, and one of his children might be familiar to us, which is Morpheus, right? Morpheus was known for changing forms, and so Morpheus would go into dreams and be able to change into human form in people's dreams. So Morpheus was also associated with sleep. And Hypnos also had a role in the Trojan War. Hera asked Hypnos to put Zeus to sleep, so he wouldn't be able to help the Trojans. And so Hypnos was important because, after all, sleep is half of our lives. And here we see him depicted leaning forward, in motion, looking downwards. And whenever he looked into the eyes of his subjects, he would put them to sleep. He would make them fall asleep. And here he's looking down at a figure that really isn't present. I mean, there would be, a subject here that he would be putting to sleep. And we have to imagine that subject. We have to complete the story on our own. And this is something that happens sometimes in Hellenistic sculptures, that a story, a scene that would really probably require one or two different figures or more to really understand the narrative, to understand what's going on, was depicted just with one, kind of leaving the spectator to complete the scene on their own. And so this is what we have to do, kind of complete the scene mentally with this hypothetical figure that would be here, that he would be putting to sleep. And we can also notice too that it kind of looks like there's two different angles, there's two different ways that we can look at this sculpture. If we look at it from the front, we can appreciate his intense gaze and that he's looking down and that he's putting this subject to sleep. And then if we come to the side, we can see this long stride and this pronounced inclination. So it looks like there's two different ways that we can appreciate this sculpture. And this is something else that really links the original sculpture perhaps to the 2nd century BC, because this was something that was common at that time, to present a sculpture and kind of give two different ways maybe that you could look at that piece. Now, as I mentioned before, this is a Roman replica. This is a copy of a Greek bronze. But we have to remember that at that time, they had a completely different idea of the value of originality. There wouldn't have been any qualms, there wouldn't have been any trouble with the value of a replica or a copy versus the original. There's no reason that a replica would have had any less importance, any less significance than the original Greek bronze. Now his arms have been lost. We can see often, we know, extremities are some of the first things of classical sculptures that break off because they stick out, and then they're most fragile, and then they're lost. But we know that his right arm extended forward, and it would have held a horn that would hold an elixir made of herbs and water from the river Lethe. Now, the river Lethe was one of the 5 rivers of the underworld, and it was associated with forgetfulness. And so this elixir would put anyone to sleep if it just touched their lips. And in his left arm, in his hand, he would have held a bunch of poppies. And poppies are, of course, also associated with drowsiness. He also would have had wings in the original sculpture. And this trunk here really is for stability. We have to remember that marble is a really, really heavy material. And so this kind of leaning, this inclination here would have required a really strong base. Often when you see in sculptures that the decorative base, that there's a base that seems decorative or has an attribute, sometimes it really is also there to add stability, to add strength. Now, much of the collection of classical sculpture is here today thanks to the Queen Isabel de Farnesio. Isabel de Farnesio was the second wife of King Philip V of Spain, and she helped negotiate the purchase of the sculpture collection of Queen Christina of Sweden in 1724. But this actually wasn't purchased by Isabel. This didn't come into the collection at this time. The sculpture actually entered the collection earlier, and it might have even been one of the first pieces to do so. In 1557, the first two statues of the collection were donated to the Spanish royal family. And one of them was a statue of Mercury, and the description might match this one of Hypnos in motion. Now, I said that this is Hypnos, this is not Mercury, but the thing is that this was actually identified as Mercury up until the 19th century. Now, we have to remember that determining the identity of these pieces can often be really difficult, and it's part of the work of art historians because these things are found in archaeological sites and they're often fragmented, and then often throughout history they're reconstructed in different ways, sometimes aggressively and not always correctly. And so all of these things add up to the complication of identifying the person that's represented. So until the 19th century, this was identified as Mercury, and it's interesting to know that when it was found in the Renaissance, that the scholars of the time weren't able to pin this down as Hypnos. They didn't recognize it as Hypnos, and they mistook it for Mercury because he was commonly represented at the time. But the confusion probably really originates with these wings. This is something that's characteristic of Mercury, right? These wings. But here with Hypnos, we see them growing out of his temples. There are a few differences in the way that the little wings are represented on Hypnos and on Mercury. In Hypnos here, they come growing out of his temples. Now, these wings would cover the eyes of his subjects and put them to sleep and provoke memory loss. And if we remember Mercury, if we can think of an image of Mercury, he has the pedicis, he has this wide-brimmed hat, and the wings grow out of his hat. So there's a little bit of a difference in how it's represented here. And another thing that helps us to identify this as Hypnos is also the inclination itself, the fact that this is a sculpture that's in motion. This wouldn't have been a typical way to represent Mercury in antiquity. We can think of lots of representations of Mercury in motion now, dynamic, moving Mercuries, but really in antiquity he was presented in a way that's very static. This wouldn't have been a typical way to represent Mercury. But this gesture, this pose, does fit with Hypnos, who would be flying over humanity and putting them to sleep. And there's also a few attributes that we would be missing with Mercury. Normally we'd see Mercury, again, with the pedicis, with the hat, with the wings that are growing out of it. Also, he might wear his cape or his sandals. Now, it's possible that this was part of the decoration of the Roman Emperor Hadrian's villa in Tivoli. And this sculpture of Hypnos would make sense in the iconographic plan of a Roman villa because of its association with ideas of rest, of sleep, of forgetfulness, and the idea of leisure, of odium, of leisure in a Roman villa. And with this, we'll conclude our short conversation in English for today, and I hope that you've enjoyed having a closer look at Hypnos and at the collection of sculpture. You can find out more about this collection on the Prado's website, and you can also find out more about the American Friends of the Prado Museum and the work that we do on our website and our sister organization, the Fundación de Amigos. So thank you for joining, and we'll see you again next Wednesday.